Significant developments continue to take place on the outskirts of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, where the Russians continue offensive operations along the supply lines heading into both of these cities. The Russians are also storming Myrnohrad from the eastern, southeastern, and northern flank of the northern portion of the city, while fighting continues in the southern portion. The Russians managed to advance into the settlements east of Pokrovsk, gaining control over additional ones, as well as an advance in the northern parts of Pokrovsk through the railway station area and the eastern parts of it. The Russians also managed to gain 100% full control over the industrial area in the northwestern parts of Pokrovsk and gain control over the entryway into the city through the E50 highway. In turn, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks, where they managed to regain control over a settlement and some additional positions on the western flank of Shakhtarske, where they're looking to cut off the Russian forces operating within the western parts of the town, which will clear up the supply routes leading into the town from the northwestern direction and from the western direction, significantly strengthening their defensive capabilities in the northern flank and offensive capabilities to cut off the Russian forces operating west of the Encirclements river. Starting out within Pokrovsk itself, the Russians managed to gain control over the western entryway into the city, where they put up the Russian flag. The Ukrainians responded by sending a drone to strike the flag to get it away, but this shows that the Russians have full control of the area and the Ukrainians are unable to physically go and change the flag, which shows confident control of the Russian forces. The Russians also managed to gain control over some of these fortifications along the forest line area leading up to the railway going through and along the E50 highway further northwest. With this, fighting continues on the western outskirts, just as it continues in the eastern portion, where they managed to gain full control over the industrial area and are expanding into the next section here further north in the direction of the Dacha area, where the Russian forces are slowly advancing in the northern direction. The Russians continued offensive operations in the northern portion of the Pokrovsk section of the front line. While the Russians are mapped out in my map to be under full control over the southern parts of the railway line, the reality of the situation is that there are pockets of Ukrainian soldiers in the southern parts which are encircled. The exact area is unknown, but the fact that they are encircled and the Russians are advancing beyond it, I've mapped it out as Russian control. However, these pockets, once they are closed and finished off, the Russian offensive operations north of the railway line will strengthen, as Russian forces will be freed up from the sieges around the different areas of Pokrovsk. The Russian advances into the eastern parts of Pokrovsk includes full control over the highway leading up north and the starting of the fighting over the industrial area here to the north of this railway line and railway station area, including the industrial area. So the Russians are here working on entering the industrial area and have at the same time pushed in the eastern direction through the highway, where they are isolating this industrial area and trying to cut it off from other positions, potentially to create an additional pocket, and continuing along the highway up towards the intersection. The fighting is also reaching the apartment complex area in the northeastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, which will likely be the final stand of the Ukrainian forces within the city. As for the western direction, the Russians are expanding their operations in the northern direction towards the Dacha areas, where they're looking to completely cut off any connection west of Myrnohrad and outside of the two cities to prevent the Ukrainians from withdrawing. The Ukrainians are still attempting to withdraw through the dirt road in between Rodinske and Pokrovsk. However, the Ukrainian forces at this point, the ones withdrawing, are going to be taking a lot of casualties due to the Russian direct fire control over the area. Speaking of Russian fire control in the area, the Russians managed to advance gain control over some of the farm areas in the northern flank of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, south of Rodinske, along the highway. They've already advanced to cut off the intersection, but with this, they solidified their controls here south of Rodinske and Lyman, following the capture of the city. And fighting continues on the outskirts of the city as the Ukrainians are attempting to regain control over it and are counterattacking towards it from the northern and western flanks, looking to establish a foothold. The Russian forces are here working on cutting off the supply lines heading in and out of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, while the Ukrainians are looking to outflank the Russian forces. In the Myrnohrad direction, the Russians have managed to gain control over the first buildings in the apartment complex area in the southeastern parts of the northern section of the city. With this, the Russians have started storming the city itself from here, this southeastern direction, and have established a foothold within it. To the north of this, the Russians have managed to advance through the residential area gaining control over several buildings here in the eastern parts of the city. On the northern flank of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to recapture Droshne. This is the third time they've managed to recapture it following a Russian capture. And the objective of the Ukrainians here is to regain control over Nikolaevka, which had been contested all throughout this month, to cut off the western positions and again through the Kasanie-Terets river line, where they're looking to regain control of it. In addition to this, the Ukrainians continued their offensive operations to regain control of the western flank of Shakhove, where they're here pushing through along the road to the west and gaining control over the forest lines on the flanks of the road. They're looking to regain full control over the western flank to cut off the connection of Russian forces up towards western parts of Shakhove. The Russian forces here are already operationally encircled, with the Ukrainians having control over the western flank. There is no proper road to resupply their forces. Instead, they're mainly being resupplied through drones at this point and on feet or smaller vehicles on off-road directions towards Shakhove. The objective of the Russians here is to gain full control over Shakhove before they are cut off at the west, or to counterattack in the western direction to stop the Ukrainian counterattack in the area. But also it is to buy as much time as possible as they are closing in on Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, gain full control over both cities. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, where in the south of the first line of defense, the Russians have gained control over additional forest lines to the west of Poltavka through an offensive operation along the southern parts of the defensive line to gain control over the settlements of Vesele, Selenyi and Vysoke. Russians are prioritizing Vesele first, as it is fairly undefended and isolated from the rest, and it also overlooks the southern settlements. With their positions in the north, the Russians could flank the fortifications from the northern direction, whereas Selenyi has several fortifications within and outside the town, all facing in the southern direction. This means they push through Vesele, gaining control over the settlement, and then pushing down towards Selenyi will allow them to flank their fortifications from their weakest point, and then down towards Vysoke further south. To the north of this, along the second line of defense, the Russians have managed to gain control over Krasnoyarsk, which is the final settlement on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River. With this, Russians have full control over all of the settlements on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River, down from Melinivka and all throughout, all the way up to Vishneve, following which it becomes the northern and southern bank of the river rather than the eastern and western bank. This means that the Russians have full control over the eastern bank and have several footholds across bridgeheads across the river line, where they are establishing themselves to create a proper bridgehead to start offensive operations on the western bank as well. This is in addition to the capture of Melinivka and Poltavka along the western bank of the river line. The Russians are here working to expand the zone of control from Novomykolaievka down towards the fortifications south of the settlement, which will allow them to then push further south to connect with Poltavka and have a road connection on the western bank of the Yanchur River, at the same time to expand in the northern direction to gain control over the road and bridge across the Yanchur River to connect with Uspenivka before pushing up further north to gain full control over the settlement. This will allow the Russians to control and gain access between Poltavka all the way through Uspenivka and then up towards Rybne, where following the capture of Krasnoyarsk, the Russians can do a combined push from Slahoda in the north, which is on the western bank of the river line, and connect with the forces in Krasnoyarsk on the eastern bank with a river crossing. Moving up to the eastern section of the front line to the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to make several advances to the south of Siversk. The Russians gained control over some fortifications here on the eastern parts of Svenivka and have managed to gain a foothold within Svenivka itself, both along the railway line and along the road connecting Preresne up towards Svenivka. With this, the Russians are pushing from the eastern direction through the railway line up towards Svenivka from the east, and from the south all throughout Preresne up towards Svenivka, where they're looking to gain control of the farm area to the east of Svenivka, along the railway up towards gaining full control over the settlement itself and the railway line connecting the two sectors in the east and the west. Following the capture of the fortifications to the northeast, the Russians have managed to gain control over the high ground that is overlooking the central areas, and with that they are taking advantage of their new gained control over these overlooking heights to then capture the areas in between that of Vyemka and Svenivka. And with this, Russians continue offensive operations on the southern flank of Siversk to cut off the southern highway that connects and resupplies Siversk positions through the southwest, cutting off that highway, and with the offensive operations on the northern flank, they would be able to cut off all roads in and out of Siversk, operationally encircle the town, and then start the siege of it by trying to squeeze out the Ukrainian forces defending the town, similar to what they're doing in the Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk directions. As for the Lyman direction, the Russians have managed to solidify their foothold in the northeastern micro-district of Lyman, just outside of the city that is connected to it and part of it. The Russians have managed to gain full control of it, and the offensive operations continues on the eastern flank of the city, along the railway line, towards the highway to the south, and along the micro-district in the north. All of this to establish a foothold within the eastern parts of the city and continue offensive operations on the flanks of it. In the north, on the outskirts of Kupyansk, the Russians continue offensive operations along the highway, where they've managed to cut off the road connection to the eastern parts of Kupyansk, encircling the Ukrainian forces along the Usk river line. With this, the Ukrainians are forced to either withdraw across the river line towards the eastern parts of Kupyansk or to fight their way out through the south, where the Russians will have fire control over those positions. At the same time, the Russians continue offensive operations along the apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city. In turn, the Ukrainians are launching consistent counterattacks in the southern portion of the city, where they're looking to regain control over the southern parts and kick the Russians back through the city, while they are threatening the supply lines in the northern portion, where they're looking to launch counterattacks and have been launching counterattacks to regain control over the areas. The Ukrainian forces have been trying to break through their positions by cutting off the positions near Radkivka and Holyubivka. However, every single time the Russians have been able to destroy them and regain control over these positions, allowing them to hold control over the supply lines into the city while continuing offensive operations within it and pushing back the Ukrainian counterattacks. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.